When I think about landscape, I think about this sort of framing of a vista that's contained, it's been kind of selected.
I was pushed by the concept of movement in these pieces.
You have to think about the canvas as a physical object.
Every work started life on the floor.
The beginning of abstract painting is in the edges of old master paintings.
It's a record of the process through which it was made.
Maybe they are sculptures. Why are they not sculptures? Why are they paintings?
My full name is Essence Harden, but you can just call me Essence. And I am the curator, one of two, at the California African American Museum, CAM, and Exposition Park. And I write about art independently for a number of years. I went to UC Berkeley for Black Studies. I am not an art historian. I'm a Black visual culture person. So a lot of the ways that I think about art and I think about practice and even the way that I curate is kind of guided and steered in that tradition, which is multidisciplinary. So I'm not lecturing. I'm not going to do that. But I am here with questions, and I'm going to facilitate and hope that we all sort of feel comfortable enough, and I imagine y'all do because you're in crit, I'm often, to speak aloud and to share our thoughts. And then we'll sort of like transfer over after that transfer, but we'll like have more of like Ben coming in and the studio coming in to sort of think through with us the works at hand and sort of the exhibition overall. It's obviously recorded, and in part it's recorded because it's a reference that lives on Hauser Wirth's website for other students. And so I really, so the questions can they're kind of broad in spectrum, right? And the hope is that someone else could access this and feel really, kind of motivated and interested to learn more about Frank, and have it feel maybe more tactile than maybe I think generally when I at least do research around Frank and it's recorded video, it's sort of academic and at a level that can feel maybe inaccessible to other people who aren't kind of constantly or aren't very much particularly in that lens, in that field. So I hope that it feels like, fun and chill, and the work is so beautiful and wonderful, and I feel very honored to even be here. I don't have my glasses on because they reflect off the lenses terribly, which means I also can't see that well. But so I will be reading like this a little bit, but generally I don't look that goofy. But there's this sort of quote on the back wall, and it's in the press release, and I was really sort of thinking about, and this is not a question on here, so already I'm off script, but I was really thinking about it because I think in part what I love about Black studies and what I think the sort of quest of art history, kind of like post-colonial art history in the 1980s and onward can offer us is kind of guided through this quote, which is, I want to make something completely new, something that no one has seen before. And I'm hoping that while we can exist in reference, right, we can think through other artists and particular moments while we're talking about the work, I also hope that we get to feel something and talk about sort of composition and effort and practice in this way as well. So don't feel like you need to, because I don't think it's necessary, right, to sort of give us a whole sort of art history when it comes to how Frank is positioned. But I really want us to consider the actual exhibition at hand. Also, I curate, right? So I'm always really concerned with like, why were these works chosen? What do these works mean in relationship? Why is this the sort of title? And what is the question at hand of the exhibition, the works that are in it, how they are in practice with each other and play with each other. And the first sort of question here is what makes a landscape and what is a landscape? And there's a second part to that, but I think just kind of grounding in that experience, what is a landscape and what makes a landscape? It's the name of the exhibition, obviously, and here we are with all these works. So who feels motivated to speak aloud and to kind of share their thoughts around that?
Well, I feel like in this context, landscape, Frank was thinking about sort of more fluid elements that are part of landscape rather than sort of land itself or kind of other rigid parts that sort of form or often is considered as forming landscape. So I'm thinking, elements such as water, light, weather conditions, and so on are kind of present here. Just knowing about how Frank lived, all of his life near water, from being born in Bartica, a town known as the land of water itself, and then moving to London, having lived near Thames, and I know he's talked about having always been near water, and I feel like his notion of landscape is one that certainly goes sort of beyond the idea of borders, and I feel like that is definitely felt through these paintings.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel there's so much, I was saying to Ben, to not see him in process, but to see movement in still works, right? And that kind of relationship to, his relationship to water and the geology that surrounds water that's particular to movement and writing being created and being submerged.
When I think about landscape, I think about this sort of framing of a vista that, it's contained, it's been kind of selected, but there's always the implication that it's just one part of perhaps like an infinite field that just goes on and on. And what I find interesting about these paintings is these borders that are, different colors that my eye kind of just bounces around rather than kind of think about what's going on beyond. I continue to come back. It's like Pong or one of those screensavers where it just continuously bounces around. So every time I travel across the landscape in front of me, I reach a different point, and then that invites me to come back. So that it's always recontextualized. So it's always something different. And so whatever landscape's meant to mean to Frank Bowling, I just think about that and how the landscape is sort of a snapshot of something that goes on and on and on, but it's also a place where you can find infinite pleasure and insight and intrigue simply by allowing yourself to spend time with it.
I think, context of sort of understanding where you're entering a painting from, right? You're like, I'm from California. It's how I kind of ground myself in my visual experience, and our relationship to water on this coast is so different than the Caribbean, England, New York, right? Like the triangle in which Frank existed in, and making this work in particular. So,
and also in London, not that I've ever been, but I'm assuming it's very gray, and in California it's the opposite.
It's green. It rains
gray.
there. You have green space, right?
Exactly. Yeah, but I'm just saying, being from the West Coast, it's you see this color, this neon, the introduction of neon. Me and my cohort were talking about the neon in his work and how it's very pronounced in a way that's very, not tacky, but in a way that's very intentional.
Absolutely, yeah, closer to California for sure. And I think that's a really actually wonderful point, right? Around sort of reduction and openness that gets you ultimately to hear. I really love that. I think what's also really beautiful about Frank's work is the way that, and I'm gonna let you talk in 1 second, I'm so sorry. But I'm I'm thinking out loud with everyone else, is how it always just feels so contemporary, it always feels so new and at the verge. I guess his request feels very felt, right? That quest for newness, we're always I'm coming to it as something I've never seen before. And I think for an artist with such a vast career, that is generally relatively strange to have someone feel at the vanguard constantly.
For me, I couldn't help when I walked in is to see a Caribbean twist on Rothko in many ways, bringing, his experience of being from Guyana, living in Europe, and then flourishing in New York. So combined, it's a summation of all these experiences. And I think that's why he continues to be so contemporary, because he's going back and forth this are kites, correct?
Kite too?
Kate.
Yeah.
So that's probably childhood. That's a landscape of something you wouldn't see this in New York maybe, or London.
every work started life on the floor. And Dad abandoned the easel in about 1966 on moving to New York and saw the possibilities of what painting could be, abandoning easel painting, but still with the English landscape tradition, I think, inside him. But what then happens is that the paintings are pulled up the wall. And I think that they'll be pulled up the wall in different stages. One thing I've noticed looking at the works, and perhaps the way in which the work is, if you like, being curated, is that I'm seeing horizon lines, a central kind of horizon line in almost all the works. So the first stage is on the floor. There's a lot of water, huge amount of water. The canvas is unprimed. And the first sort of stage is for a lot of water and a lot of liquid acrylic paint to be floating across the surface. But then as it's pulled up the wall, then you get these drips and the stuff is splashed and, so the very end of the process is the adding of the edges and he refers to as mariflage. So they start out life on the floor, end up on the wall, and that's kind of where he's looking at it and thinking about a title. So, and then ultimately, I suppose, there are conventions. He was talking the other day about maybe somebody wanted to do like an external kind of installation. He thinks of them as very hardy. So I understand that feeling about wanting to touch. He says sometimes you see something, you want to touch it and you want to put it in your mouth, see how it tastes, feel the textures. They're very, very tactile.
But then that movement going up the wall is recorded within the painting.
It is.
So it's part of it. So
it is.
Changes completely then.
Yes,
it becomes of the wall.
Yeah, somebody said that they kind of bear the marks. It's a record of the process through which it was made. And you see it in different works. Things work in different ways. Yeah. But yeah, you can definitely see the process is there, visible.
The work behind you in particular, what is this called, Kite 1? Like, this is like a really nice ideal example to sort of think through. Fantastic question. Yeah, of course. And I do want to like kind of come back and have everyone kind of think through that question of water that you introduced around, it's here, but that you like directly stated around the process that begins everything and sort of how that kind of shows up formally in the work, but
you and I, before we started, were talking about his idea, which I think was included at some point in the MFA Boston show, about how like the beginning of abstract painting is in the edges of old master paintings, right? And so it's interesting to hear you say that he finishes on the edges, which like of course he does, but I didn't really like think about that at any point. So I'm like, is there, or have you ever heard him say anything about that relationship, about how abstraction begins at the edges of historical paintings, but he ends his abstract paintings at the edges?
It's a question that I shall be putting to him as soon as I get back to London. Just picking up on the two bits and seeing if I can make a connection. So he would, in talking with people about abstract painting, he would take people to the National Gallery to like look at a Titian and say, look at the edges. You see, when you look at the edges of the work, yes, it's representational, it's figurative, and yet what the painter is doing here is something which is an abstraction. It's about how the paint is going to apply to the surface, color, form, and then when you look at like late Turner especially, but also Constable, look at the studies of skies. Yes, they're skies, they're clouds. But he says what they're really doing is playing with paint.
Yeah.
Trying to see what the paint will do, what it will give you. That's the one bit. In terms of the edges, so he started using edge additions to the work in the 1980s, because the 80s work, which, a footnote, hasn't really been seen since the 80s. There hasn't been a show of 80s works.
Why?
Well, when the work was made in the mid-80s, they showed at the Serpentine in 1986.
Yeah.
The critics hated it
The British critics
The
hated
British
it.
critics
Yeah.
hated it. Partly because painting was dead. Conceptual art, video, architecture, whatever, was, painting was not thought of as a thing.
Yeah.
And then the surfaces of the canvas had a lot of built up surface, a lot of acrylic gel, but also acrylic foam, maybe an inch proud of the surface of the canvas.
And they didn't know what to make of it.
Didn't know what to make of it. One person wrote to one of the art newspapers saying, "Why are you showing this? Why are you talking about Frank Bowling? Is this even painting? We don't think it's even painting." When he became a Royal Academician, you are to give a work, what they call it, your diploma work. The Royal Academy refused it. And I think it was probably, they said, it's too large. It's like, you're too tall for this job, or too short. I think it was, they just didn't know what to make of it.
Yeah.
But in terms of the technical side, the work was so thick you couldn't stretch it around the canvas, around the stretcher bars. So we added lighter weight canvas, which is glued and stapled.
Got it.
And you can see the staple marks. It looks a bit like stitching.
Yeah.
So from the 80s onwards, the edges have become almost like a signature feature of the work. Sometimes the edges of the mariflage is very plain, like a dark green or a dark blue. In some cases, like in this work and in the On the Way paintings on the other side, the mariflage sits under the canvas when it's on the wall. So there could be, there's layers of paint going on, and the mariflage picks up the paint which drips to the floor.
Right.
It's then cut to size and then glued and stapled to the edges. And then sometimes usually we'll finish with a chalk line, which is then sprayed. So what's going on up here is that the chalk is applied to the top edge once the stapling has been finished, and then he's washed over the chalk with ammonia, and that's created these kind of ethereal kind of drips that have a kind of Northern Lights sort of effect coming from the way that the edges have been put on.
Don't make that face. That was perfect. I guess this question of water and abstraction, and that's like a really cool quote around abstraction starting in the edges of masters' paintings. I want to throw to the rest of you, and especially if you haven't said anything, what do you think about that? Sort of how does that settle or fall with you? These sort of questions around abstraction, these questions around water, these questions around movement and process. And I always love, and this sort of, love of paint, right? And its possibilities. So, yeah. Thanks.
When you asked if he makes it on the floor, then why is it not exhibited on the floor? That made me think about painting versus sculpture, because if we considered these sculptures, then they probably would be on the floor. So it's interesting to think about that. And then also what you said about how critics were like, is this even a painting? So I think it's just interesting to kind of be flexible in how we're thinking of these works, of like, maybe they are sculptures, or like why are they not sculptures? Why are they paintings?
Sure. Nice formal questions.
Well,
I know he's a formalist.
Two very brief kind of responses to that.
Of course.
In 1989 to 1990, Dad actually did make sculptures. There are only about 12 exist. The rest, so they're made, they're basically welded steel, made from scrap metal. Many of them have gone back to scrap. They were stolen and turned back into scrap metal. But the 12 that remain are very interesting geometrically. A lot of the things that you see in the works, horizon lines, circles, diagonals, rectangles working with circles. So there are sculptures. And there was a show of sculpture last year in London, which there's a fantastic book, Frank Bowling Sculpture, in which the author, Sam Cornish, talks about the relationship between the welded steel sculptures and the sculptural nature of the work. So there definitely is a kind of, these are like maybe reliefs almost sometimes, that there's definitely something sculptural going on in them. In which case it could be on the floor. But another thought is that, so my grandmother, his mother, was a seamstress, a dressmaker, a milliner. She made hats and dresses and saris in Guyana. And I've been thinking since I've been here for this show that this is, although obviously it's painting, it's also textiles. I'm thinking, I suppose, of Sam Gilliam as well, and what the staining and dyeing of canvas. So in that sense, if you think about them as textiles, are they, again, maybe they could be floor pieces.
Like I think when you see these effects of the liquid, that is like the way that it has moved on the canvas, it's obvious that it was done on a flat surface. And so you kind of, you have to think about the canvas as a physical object and it being on the floor. And also with the addition of like the COVID tests in this one, for example, like I start to think about it as physical landscape. Like, you imagine being able to stand on it, being able to like move around the canvas as a physical space. But then of course, when it's on the wall, there's the added layer of it as a pictorial landscape, and you start to see, like you were saying, the horizon line and the sort of like, you start to see paths and oceans and skies, and you start to look at it, especially knowing the show is called Landscape, you start to look at it as you would look at a landscape and see narrative within it too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I was initially really challenged with your question, like, what is landscape? And I was pushed by the concept of movement in these pieces as a way of understanding landscape. And, because like life isn't still, and it's the movement that is perhaps like evoking feeling. And especially Kite 2, I sensed some discomfort.
They do need to be this joyful and colorful because it is creating potential and space for development against all odds.
Well,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. I think that, so he's born in Antarctica, kind of a long way upriver, the Essequibo River, really kind of on the edge of the rainforest. Although he has no memory of that, he moved to New Amsterdam, which is closer to the Atlantic coast on the Berbice River. Then to London, age 19, arriving from what is then a colony, considering himself to be kind of unproblematically British, as many colonial subjects did at that period. Discovering himself to be problematically British in a way that would be denied very vividly by the British political system and the vernacular commentary on, as Paul Gilroy said, there ain't no black in the Union Jack. So that whole post-war period and the reception of black British people on arriving in England. Then disaffected by the sense that Britain, he was told by a senior curator, Britain was not yet ready for a gifted artist of colour. He found himself being seen as first and foremost a black artist and pushed into a direction, he felt being pushed into a direction where he had to kind of represent in a way that was about echoing political concerns. And some of the figurative work from the 50s and early 60s does pick up on those things. Like, for example, there's a self-portrait as Othello. So he's kind of channeling some of that, and there are works that kind of deal with political issues. But he, like the martyrdom of Patrice Lumumba, the Congolese leader assassinated, dissatisfied with and feeling disenfranchised and kind of constrained by his situation in Britain. In '66, he properly moves to New York. And the works from the period immediately after moving to New York are on show in San Francisco at the moment. But he's not an African-American artist, although in many ways, of course, he is an African-American from South America, but he's not like a black American. So he's kind of marginal to that too. And I think that's been, in many ways, a huge detriment to him in his journey, because wherever he is, he's not quite of that place. And, you know, of course, making art is not about a market and a genre and a niche and a brand. You can make art, but then you've got to make a living, right? And so that was really hard. So he wasn't in the right place at the right time at any point, or momentarily he was. So he kept on making work, kept on painting. Often, you know, he had no representation in England until into the 2000s. So he's been making work for 65 years now. He's 89 years old, still in the studio. He's in the studio today, this morning. There's gel on the surface of the canvas and it's cracking. And that's because there's been heat applied to the surface. So the found objects began, I think, in the 80s. Yeah. Particularly like his stepdaughters would leave costume jewelry around and he would look at it and just, you know, chuck it into the canvas and then stick a load of gel on it. At one point, he was interested in thinking about how spiders might work on the surface. There's a wonderful work called Witness that has all these, it's like probably, you know, maybe even 100 spiders crawling over the surface. I think in this case, he actually did ask for a bag of creepy crawlies to be bought, and he just, you know, chucking them in. So there's a scorpion here. This insect here has got this metallic kind of wing case, which just by coincidence picks out the metallic blues here. Yeah. There's flies, there's quite a few. And I think that he's interested in what's going on the surface. Yeah. It's called Biter. Yeah. I think that, you know, one of the reasons he decided that he didn't want to live in Guyana anymore was the bugs. There's a lot of mosquitoes, a lot of bugs, a lot of snakes of different kinds. But I don't think it's necessarily about anything in the same way that the paintings are not landscapes. Yeah. And they're not, you know, maybe he says something like, I'm not painting a landscape, I'm painting the idea of a landscape. Mm-hmm. And here it's kind of, it's like a fetid, kind of maybe polluted pool, perhaps. But, you know, you can read it in whatever way you wish. Yeah. But he also is not a painter who wants to go to the studio and experience angst, you know. It's like you've got to have fun in your work, right?
Absolutely.
You've got to go to the studio and enjoy what you're doing.
You would hope.
So I think it's very playful. I mean, some of the other stuff, like this is just, this is, I think, a crab's claws that was kind of mashed up. These are bits from the studio floor. There are seashells. There's, you know, all kinds of, often you see bits of the edges of the canvas that have come, the strings that have come loose. This is the stopper from an ammonia kind of bottle. There's all kinds of things going on here, and the way that the ammonia is kind of doing something with the chalk and the acrylic paint and the color that's happening here. It's inexplicable, really. I think you've got to see what you see in it. Yeah, and I think that question around play and having fun in the studio and with your practice overall is really felt. And when I think the thing around scholarship can be so serious often to the point where you know, if you read about something and you've never seen it, you might really imagine it to be quite different than you're here in person. You're like, oh, and that space between kind of, you know, academic vernacular and art that's actually being presented to you, I always love to sort of broaden as much as humanly possible, right? Like, so that you're not far away from it always. And I can't wait to take my kid here, who is 3, and she's really good at all this stuff, and will really thoroughly enjoy it. But I do want to sort of have, that was such like a beautiful way, and I knew this painting was going to do that, to almost end it. But if there's anyone who kind of wants to say anything else, either about this work or any work in the exhibition, I think we likely have like a few more minutes here. Yeah.
You said something earlier about how in the 80s painting is dead. And so in the 2020s, I'm not a capital P painter, but I do like to think about figuration and representation. And I think about that a lot in terms of like modernity. And I feel like, is painting exhausted now in 2020?
I feel that he has a lot of play in this painting and his found objects. And I feel that he found his sense of harmony and happiness. And I've been studying his work, and I'm just amazed how he escapes his daily life, and he just steps into that different portal, like out of the ordinary into his extraordinary work. And I'm just amazed how he just uses his techniques and expanding on found objects and the colors. This painting feels like he found his happy painting here, finding like child mind, like finding his just found objects like toys, bottle caps, also the bugs too. And I feel like he has like a memory of that place he was at, and to now from where he was from to where he's at now, kind of like follows him, and he has like a memory in his mind.
Somebody said after I was speaking yesterday that it's like automatic writing. This kind of psychoanalytic kind of idea that you have as an unconscious. So you're doing one thing, but you're doing something else that you're not really aware of. Your unconscious is doing something, and he's just kind of playing. He's looking at the way the paint is moving across the canvas, his choice of colors, the geometry of the canvas. What he's doing is kind of intuitive. Sometimes he's very clear about what he's going to do. Sometimes it's completely improvised. And yet the idea of the automatic writing is that as you're just doing this thing, meaning appears. It's a bit like lying on the psychoanalyst's couch, free associating. You're just saying one thing and the analyst sort of says, that's interesting that you've said. And it's kind of, there it is. It's musings on, kind of maybe pools in Guyana. But he doesn't think that that's what he's doing. What he's doing is seeing what the paint will do and watching the movement of the paint across the canvas.
It's like writing a novel, right? It's like drafting, like thinking of Toni Morrison at 4 o'clock in the morning being like, and the characters come and the things come to me, right? Like, and then I make meaning out of them and you're able to supplement it,
Yeah, like dreaming. Sometimes our dreams are so vivid and clear, and, so here he is moving the stuff across the canvas, and it's almost like there's a kind of dream world being made manifest on the canvas.
It feels like that, which is why it feels so good.
I love the idea of, satisfaction is almost like feeding us, giving us stuff to a visual feast, and people come in here looking for something, and while you're here, you're feeling yourself being filled up maybe, and then you can leave here feeling, as you said, feeling satisfied. That's beautiful.
That's nice. Ooh, is that a good ending? I think so. Thank you. Thank you. Y'all were like so wonderful. That was so easy.
Hey.
Wonderful.